Okay, well, good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on your time zone. We've had a full day of excellent presentations today, but I've been particularly looking forward to this one most of the day. I'm really pleased to be here with you chairing this session on defining extremism. We have with us three scholars who don't really need an introduction, as their work is quite well known to us in the field. We'll be first hearing from Dr. Keiran Hardy from Griffith University on countering violent extremism, the role and the rule of law. And then we'll be treated to a discussion on defining and conceptualizing extremism. Professor Cassam from the University of Warwick will be presenting on his recent book, Extremism, A Philosophical Analysis. And last but certainly not least, we have J.M. Berger here with us, who will offer a discussant's response to Professor Cassam's talk. I'd just like to take an extra second, though, to particularly thank our international presenters, Professor Cassam and J.M. Berger, for making the time to join us live, as it's 7 a.m. in the UK and 3 a.m. in the US. So sincerely, thank you very, very much. Please be sure to put any questions in the Q&A, and you can do so at any time during the presentations. And so without further ado, let's start with Dr. Keiran Hardy for his presentation, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lydia. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, we can. Thanks. Go ahead.
I'm just having a little bit of trouble sharing my screen. Sorry, but I will. I can log out and come straight back in, or I could talk to it. And I'm not sure if Ben had the slides and could move through, but that might be a little bit awkward. Sorry, but
well, Ben, if you could let us know in the chat if you're able to pull up the slides. Is the share screen working for you, Keiran?
No, sorry, I have to quit and restart the app, so I won't do that. And if they appear, then if you make your best attempt I won't keep telling you to move on unless I need to, but if you make your best attempt to move through, I'm very happy with that. Thank you. So I'll make a start and just talk about the aims, which is on the next slide. Yeah, firstly, just to thank Lydia and Michelle for asking me to be part of this, and feel very privileged to be part of such an excellent program. And I know how much work it takes to organize a conference too. I'm doing that at the moment. Thank you to all the organization team as well. So what I would like to do is to talk about the role and rule of law in countering violent extremism. And I think this is very important because so much of the focus of counterterrorism law literature and discussion, not just in Australia, but around the world, focuses on law as a coercive measure. So we talk about preparatory offences and conspiracies to prepare and control orders, PDOs, all this kind of stuff. So what I really want to do today is to talk about the role of the other roles that law plays, and as it is relevant to aims that align with CVE, like rehabilitation, prevention of radicalisation, and so on. So we'll talk through some different things, including defining extremism, but then I want to move that debate beyond that. So Ben, if we'd be okay if you move to the next slide. I don't need to define CVE for this audience, but as I said, I will exclude the more coercive measures. But one exception to that I want to come back to is the offence of advocating terrorism, because I believe that while it's a coercive measure and a measure with punishment, I do believe that is particularly relevant to the idea of countering the spread of terrorist ideology. So that's the one exception. So to start with defining extremism as a topic, most of the debate around the role of law in countering violent extremism has really surrounded whether and how we would define extremism in legislation. So in Australia, section 100.1 of the Criminal Code defines a terrorist act as according to a certain kind of formula, which includes a political, religious and ideological motive, and that's quite similar in the UK and elsewhere. But we don't have a definition of extremism formally in the law. And so next slide, please, Ben. What we see is an attempt, and a lot of these debates have been from the UK, around how do we put a definition like this into legislation? So extremism being opposition to fundamental British values and so on. And Ben, if you could please move through the next few slides. We have different views on this. Firstly, from Clive Walker and Jesse Blackburn saying, well, the move towards legality in CVE is a good thing. We've seen duties to prevent and so on. This is a good thing because rather than everything being just left to policy, we are actually formally putting these things into the law. And that is good. And I'll come back to what we mean by the rule of law and rule of law principles there. But they've said that the definition of extremism still remains as foggy as ever, and we can't even agree internationally on a definition of terrorism. So the idea of agreeing on having some consensus on what extremism means and putting it formally into legislation would be quite hard. On the next slide, Lucia Zedner has written about, she says, defining extremism is definitely difficult, but the failure to do so is hazardous, in part because we need this legality and certainty behind the law to provide some kind of structure and rules as to how CV works, rather than it being the product of policy and community action to have some kind of framework or obligations behind that. So she is very much for defining extremism, even though that's difficult because we need that clarity. But on the next slide, Kent Roach has written that while in theory, certainty and legality is a good thing, CV is actually, it's better to keep it as a non-law space, as a non-legal space. We have the coercive aspects of counterterrorism in the law. Why don't we keep CVE for the kind of parts of counterterrorism that are more community-based, and an attempt to define that in the law may actually see an expansion of state power and dangers to CVE that are unwanted. So that would summarize a lot of the debate on law and CVE. And what I want to do today is really three things. One is to map the roles and functions that law already plays in CVE beyond this debate about defining extremism in the law. The second is to identify any barriers to law playing an effective role in CVE, and I'll come back to a number of them. And then the third, which is where the rule of law comes in, as opposed to the role and functions of the law, is to identify the principles that should apply to legislation and law as it plays a role in CVE. So Ben, if you could please move on to the next slide. I'll mention the advocacy offence briefly. I mentioned this already. So we have an offence punishable by 5 years imprisonment under section 80.2C of the Criminal Code. And this is where somebody counsels, promotes, encourages, or urges the doing of a terrorist act or terrorism offence. Now, what we call accessorial liability has an incitement, has always applied to criminal offences. This is a specific offence really designed in part to address the threat of extremism online and the spread of that. And so on the next slide, there is the case of Aaron Gould from the UK, which raised a number of interesting issues around this. And so Mohammed Gould was a university student, and he posted videos online about, and he was put in prison for 5 years for disseminating terrorist publications for videos that included attacks on coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also in Chechnya as well. And so the case raised quite a number of issues, some around the definition of terrorism, because obviously whatever is in the videos needs to be defined as terrorism for his crime of disseminating those to apply. But also kind of a more general free speech point, I think, not in the sense of necessarily we should be supporting this or whatever, but is the law as a coercive measure an appropriate kind of intervention when he may well have benefited from some other kind of program. So we see some blurring of the law's role and the CVE role, and raises that question of what is the most appropriate response. And then as we move through, and I'll need to move through these functions of the law relatively quickly. But as we move on, Ben, if you could please move on. What we've seen a really key development in the law is a duty to prevent. And we see this in the UK in the Counterterrorism and Security Act. We haven't seen anything quite like this in Australia just yet. But a general duty on specified authorities, essentially to implement, channel, and aspects of prevent. That raised a whole range of issues around institutional freedom, academic freedom in particular, because university staff and other members of public institutions were required as a legal obligation to deliver these kinds of programs and receive training in them and so on. So that raises kind of some similar issues. On the next slide, and I realize I'm running through these relatively quickly, but I want to make sure we'll get to the principles as well. In Australia, we've seen the abhorrent violent material laws recently introduced in response to Christchurch. That's okay, Ben, stay on this slide. Which are around removing the live streaming or other kind of recording of audio-visual material of terrorism and so on. So that's similar in a way, but a different kind of application. It's more similar to what we've seen with child pornography laws and the removal of dangerous content. And then into information sharing, Ben, back to that slide, is to also say that law already plays a role. And this shows you that law outside what we typically think of counterterrorism laws plays a really key role in countering violent extremism as well. And it can be things like information sharing and privacy rules in the law, which determine when agencies can share information in relation to an individual. So obviously we all have private information or personal information under the law, that can only be shared between agencies for certain purposes. And if you move on, Ben, to the Victorian report on the expert panel report on terrorism and violent extremism, which identified these rules around information sharing as being a kind of a sticking point or a barrier in terms of agencies being able to share information at an early stage, because typically what triggers the ability to share private information about a person is either a threat to safety or a criminal investigation. And so earlier on, where agencies might want to help an individual by having an early intervention, the law can provide a barrier there. And this is quite consistent with other critiques of privacy law around open data and so on, where agencies have, even where they can share the information, there's been research showing that there can be a reluctance to, out of a belief in legality, and I don't want to break the rules by sharing this information, so a hesitancy to share that. So information sharing is another key role that the law plays. If we keep moving on, sorry, just flick through those few slides. Supervisory orders is another key area where this plays a role. So we see firstly like bail, just as an ordinary part of the court's role. It can issue any conditions as the court sees fit where bail is granted. Now we have a presumption against bail in Australia, but it can happen. For terrorism offences. At the other end of the process, we can parole boards and parole requirements. And then somewhere in the middle, or depending where they are issued, control orders can include these requirements as well. On the next couple of slides, there are examples from the, well, there's the specific requirement in the law, or a specific option, sorry, I should say, that a requirement can be imposed upon an individual in a control order to participate in counselling or education. So while these things are still voluntary, a control order is not voluntary, and failure to comply with a control order can lead to 5 years in prison. So again, we see kind of we're seeing an increasing move, and I suppose that power has been around for quite a long time, but an increasing use of that power to enforce something that we would think of ordinarily as CVE. And the examples on the next slide from cases relate to different control order applications. So this is just an example of bail requirements to engage in counselling with the President of the Islamic Council of Victoria. On the coming slides, there are examples of the control order applications as well. So this is from Harun Korsevich's control order file. So saying that you may withdraw your consent to participate in counselling or education, but this is part of it. And what we've seen is that, say, Korsevich's experience compared to the Niesmond control order, which is on the next slide or two, it shows that different controlees can have different approaches. So Korsevich complied with those requirements, and Niesmond chose not to. And I'll come back to this aspect of enforceability and voluntariness, because I think the law raises some difficult questions around that. So if we keep moving through, and through again, Ben, sorry. What we also have is sentencing, and this is, we can stay on this slide and talk about the sentencing of the Court of Judges as playing an important role in what we would see as being the aims of CVE, one of which is to often to rehabilitate people, so the idea of tertiary prevention. Well, it's not just separate to the criminal justice system. Both courts, and we also know the prisons obviously, play a role in this process. So as part of somebody's sentence, we have ordinarily courts always determine or weigh up the principles and purposes of punishment. And these include deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, and so on. What we've seen in the terrorism cases, and there's quite a number of examples of this, is a recognition that rehabilitation is important, but also a reliance on precedent from earlier cases, such as those in Lodi, and then also Cassam and so on. That deterrence and incapacitation are more important purposes of punishment and principles of sentencing in terrorism cases compared to rehabilitation. So Ben, if you could keep moving on. You can see here the authorities have dictated that the prospects of rehabilitation will generally have little part to play in sentences imposed for terrorism offences. And I think this plays against quite a lot the idea of, it plays against the aims of CV in that respect. And so the idea of precedent in the law following previous decisions is actually a barrier there, because while in the past we may have had more hardened offenders, and older offenders, this new kind of trend of younger people coming before the court, rehabilitation may well be much more important. Another barrier is non-parole periods. So it is a requirement that any sentencing judge in a terrorism case must apply a minimum 75% non-parole period as part of the head sentence. So that means that if somebody fixes a period of 20 years imprisonment, they can't apply for parole for a minimum of 15 years. And what we've seen actually in the coming slides is a whole range of cases where judges have expressed their desire to actually sentence somebody more so on the basis of rehabilitation because of their remorse or youth, and actually not being able to impose a lower non-parole period because of that section of the Crimes Act. So if you flick through, Ben, there's quite a number of slides just on different examples of this. I would have set a lower minimum period, but I can't do that. And so expressing some kind of dismay at that and saying, these are young offenders, we would like to sentence them more appropriately, but there's actually a statutory limit that prevents us from doing that. And if we keep moving through as well, so just plenty of examples of this, and I think it's a really recurring theme in the sentencing judgments. And then that case, finally, the previous slide, don't worry, Ben, about going back, raises also the idea of voluntariness and enforcement as well, that this ultimately depends on, the law can enforce obligations, it can impose punishments and duties and so on, but it can't force somebody to change their views. So, and the sentencing judges are quite explicit about that. Another problem identified in this slide and some other case examples I have, and I assume if the slides are published that people can identify a range of these cases from those, is that often the sentencing judges want to require the person to participate in a rehabilitation program, and the offenders themselves are asking for that, but there haven't been any good programs available where they are in the local area with the necessary expertise. And while I think this is changing, the case examples that are here are only from 2 or 3 years ago, and I've seen some similar things recently. So while I think it is improving, I think that is still a barrier, the availability of programs that we know to work. And so, Ben, if we keep moving on as well, so there's, sadly, it seemed that these programs weren't available, even though at least 2 of the offenders asked to be involved in them. And if we skip through, Ben, to, these are all just kind of examples. If we focus here on the conclusions and challenges for the rule of law, the role of law, sorry, and then I'll finish on the rule of law. So while debates about defining extremism in the law continue, I would argue that the law already performs a number of functions. So beyond defining, this includes supervisory orders, duties to prevent, information sharing requirements, sentencing, bail and parole, and control order requirements, and so on. So what I'm really trying to do in this paper that I'm writing up at the moment is map these roles and functions in detail and then identify these barriers. So absolutely sufficient clarity and certainty is still an ongoing issue, but you can also see that the duties raise issues around institutional freedom, freedom of speech under encouragement and glorification offences. Amendments to the privacy law framework may well be necessary to improve CVE responses. Changes to Section 19 AG of the Crimes Act in order to improve the ability of judges to exercise discretion when sentencing, particularly young offenders. And then also the ongoing development of CVE programs, as that improves, sentencing may well be able to improve too, provided we can remove some of those structural barriers. And ultimately, like I said, the law can require people to do certain things, but it can't change somebody's mindset. And I think that's an interesting kind of problem to come back to in discussion if needed. And so if I finish then on the rule of law principles, and Ben, if you skip to the next slide after that one, which is on the principles. So the rule of law is really a collection of principles that apply to what we would want a fair legal system to involve. Originally under A.V. Dicey, a British legal philosopher, he spoke about certain formal requirements of the law that applies equally to everyone, and that laws are published and transparent and accessible. But what we have seen since then is actually a development of other principles that could really help in CVE as well. And I can finish up and leave these up there and come back to them. But that would include things like transparency, due process, an opportunity to challenge, and young people in particular being treated equally under these programs wherever they arise. So I'm happy to come back to those principles in discussion and finish up there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hardy, for that legal analysis. Now on to a philosophical analysis. We turn to Professor Cassam.
Hello. I'm going to try and share my screen with you. Hopefully you can you all see that?
Yes, we can. Yep.
Okay, good. All right. So the take-home message of my presentation is kind of very simple, which is that extremism is not one thing. There are different varieties of extremism, and no simple definition of extremism is likely to be adequate. And in my book, I distinguish between three basic varieties of extremism: methods extremism, ideological extremism, and psychological extremism. And I'll say more about this distinction in a minute. The other sort of take-home message of this presentation is that it's always a substantial question whether extremism is a bad thing. It's often assumed to be a bad thing, but if it is a bad thing, we need some explanation as to why it's a bad thing. So moving on to my distinction. Here's one type of extremism, what I call methods extremism. So methods extremists are individuals or groups or states that use or endorse the use of extreme methods in pursuit of their political objectives. So clearly the big question here is going to be what counts as an extreme method, but that's the focus of this definition. Ideological extremists, I want to say, are individuals or groups or states that subscribe to an extremist ideology. We need some story about what counts as an extremist ideology. And the third type of extremism I distinguish, psychological extremism. So psychological extremists are individuals or perhaps groups, if you think groups have minds, that have an extremist mindset. So I'll say more about what a mindset is and what an extremist mindset is. So these are three basic varieties of extremism. They're not unrelated, obviously, but nevertheless, they are distinct. Okay, so moving on to methods extremism. So what's an extreme method? So extreme methods are generally understood as involving the use of violence, but I would want to argue that not all extreme methods are violent, and using violence for political ends does not necessarily make one an extremist. If you think about the IRA hunger strikes in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, where 10 IRA prisoners starved themselves to death in pursuit of political status, that would count as an extreme method. It is less obvious that self-starvation is a form of violence. The other way around, how can you use violence in pursuit of your political objectives and not be a methods extremist? Well, if you think of the use of violence by anti-colonialist movements or the use of violence by the ANC in its campaign against apartheid, I think it's a substantive question whether the use of violence in those circumstances counted as extremism. I think in practice, when we try to figure out whether someone using violence for political ends is an extremist, in practice, we settle that question by asking a whole series of subsidiary questions. One is, was the violence being used for a just cause? Secondly, was there an alternative to violence? Thirdly, was violence proportionate in the circumstances? Was it likely to be effective? And were its targets legitimate? So a very interesting passage to read, if you haven't already read it, is chapter 17 of Nelson Mandela's book, A Long Walk to Freedom, in which he makes the case for the use of violence in the armed struggle against apartheid. Mandela's argument was that, well, of course, fighting apartheid was a just cause, but crucially, his argument was the ANC had no alternative to violence. There was no alternative. The violence it used was proportionate, and its targets were by and large legitimate, though not always. So that would be a way to represent the use of violence for political ends, not to count as methods extremism. But of course, when we think of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, their use of violence does count as methods extremism. The archetypal methods extremist uses unnecessary or disproportionate violence against illegitimate targets in pursuit of an unjust but hopeless cause. So I think on that definition, I'd want to argue that Al-Qaeda's use of violence certainly is methods extremism, whatever you think about the ANC. Moving on to ideological extremism. So the idea is very simple, very intuitive. Supposing you think of ideologies as located on a spectrum of ideologies. So you can have the left to right spectrum, for example, and an extremist ideology is simply an ideology at the fringe or far end of a spectrum of ideologies. Now, there's more than one ideological spectrum. There are lots of different ways of classifying ideologies. So, of course, most familiarly, there's the left to right spectrum. There's the pro-violence spectrum. So you can classify ideologies according to their attitudes to violence. There's the authoritarianism spectrum. You can classify ideologies according to their level of authoritarianism. So you can get different positionings depending on which spectrum you're talking about. So ultra-communism and fascism are arguably at very different ends of the left to right spectrum, but they might nevertheless be at the same end of the pro-violence spectrum. Now, this is a kind of very complicated area, but the basic thought that I have is that the position of an ideology along a given spectrum is determined by its answers to a menu of diagnostic questions. And the diagnostic questions are highly specific to a particular culture or country. So, for example, in the US, if you're trying to figure out whether someone is on the left or on the right, a relevant question might be, what's your attitude to gun control? Whereas if you're trying to figure out in a European context whether someone is on the left or on the right, that would be a very strange question to ask them. Gun control is just not an issue in Europe in the way that it is in the US. So the upshot then is that ideological extremism is relative in a number of senses. It's relative to the dimension that you're talking about, and it's relative to the particular menu of questions that you use to locate an ideology on a spectrum. Okay, so moving on to psychological extremism. So as I've said so far, being a psychological extremist means having an extremist mindset. And when I talk about a person's mindset, I'm talking about, among other things, their preoccupations, their attitudes, and their ways of thinking. And psychological extremism, I want to say, is a risk factor for extremism in the other two senses, but is not the same as methods or ideological extremism. So what am I talking about when I talk about extremist preoccupations? Now, I think extremists typically have a number of different preoccupations, and I've just highlighted two here. One is what I call the purity preoccupation. So extremists are typically preoccupied with the actual or threatened dilution of their religious, ethnic, or ideological purity by powerful external forces. So extremists typically want to embrace and promote the purest version of whatever it is that they care about. Another extremist preoccupation is what I call victimhood preoccupation. So extremists are preoccupied with their supposed victimization and humiliation by the other. So if you think of incel extremists, I think are preoccupied by their supposed humiliation by women, I guess. But I think the talk of extremism is only appropriate when there is a preoccupation with imaginary persecution. I think if you are preoccupied with actual persecution, as the ANC was with its persecution during apartheid, that doesn't make it the case that you have an extremist mindset. Moving on to extremist attitudes. So here are three, I think, fairly typical, fairly standard extremist attitudes. So one is a hostility to compromise. a tendency to regard all compromises as rotten compromises. And I'm using rotten compromise in the sense of Avishai Margalik's book on compromise, where compromise is seen by extremists or sectarians as an act of pollution. So here you have a link with the purity preoccupation. Another key extremist attitude I want to say is intolerance, intolerance of the religious, ideological, or racial other, combined with a strong sense of dualism between the realm of light and goodness, us, and the realm of evil and darkness, them. And then there's the anti-pluralism that I take to be very much part and parcel of the extremist mindset. So anti-pluralists reject the idea that there is no uniquely right way of living. And so a pluralist is someone who says there is no uniquely right way of living. People can have different visions of the good life and live their lives according to their own visions of the good life within the law. Whereas extremists typically reject that idea. They typically buy into the thought that there's basically only one correct way to live, one uniquely correct set of values, namely their values. And they do not accept the legitimacy of other people's values. So there are three extremist attitudes: hostility to compromise, intolerance, and anti-pluralism. And these attitudes go along with the extremist preoccupations that I listed earlier. So here's a kind of take-home exercise. If you're thinking about extremist attitudes and preoccupations, can you think of any that I haven't listed? I think there probably are lots of additional candidates. Moving on to types of extremist thinking. So I think there are particular styles of thought or particular styles of thinking that I would associate very much with the extremist mindset. So you find conspiracy thinking. A lot of extremists are conspiracy theorists of one sort or another. You find apocalyptic thinking, a preoccupation with the coming apocalypse. So you find that in far-right extremism in the US, where they're preparing for an apocalyptic battle with the forces of the federal government. And of course, apocalyptic thinking is absolutely fundamental to the ideology of ISIS. Manichaean thinking, catastrophic thinking, an obsession, a preoccupation with a coming catastrophe, and utopian thinking, a tendency to think in terms of a future utopia, which will come about once the extremists get their own way. So when I talk about the extremist mindset, I'm talking at the very least about these different things. Now, clearly, I'm not proposing necessary and sufficient conditions. I'm not saying that you find all of these in the case of every extremist. These various mindset features that I've identified can obtain to varying degrees. And that's why it makes perfect sense to talk about degrees of extremism. But I'd want to say that if you have an individual that displays none of the preoccupations that I've listed, none of the attitudes that I've listed, and doesn't think in any of these ways, then you do not have someone with an extremist mindset. Okay, so now I want to move on to the next question, which I take to be a kind of very interesting question, which is, well, what's so bad about extremism anyway? Now, that's a question that, of course, was famously raised by Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from Birmingham jail, in which he said, I don't have it in front of me, but it's something along the lines of, the question is not whether we shall be extremists, but whether we shall be extremists for justice or whether we shall be extremists for injustice. So for Martin Luther King Jr., the problem is not extremism per se, it is what you are an extremist in pursuit of. So extremism for justice is not a bad thing, extremism for injustice is a bad thing. And then, of course, there's the famous saying attributed to Barry Goldwater, the right-wing Republican candidate in the 1964 American presidential election, where he said that extremism in pursuit of justice is no is no vice, and moderation is no virtue. People also make a kind of historical point. This is a quotation from Breton. As is widely acknowledged, we owe our political liberties today to some extremists of the past, and too much conformity is a danger to our intellectual life and to social progress. And the emancipatory potential of extremism is often illustrated by reference to the 19th century American abolitionists, who saw themselves as extremists, saw themselves as fanatics, who were committed to the immediate and unconditional emancipation of the enslaved. So they were certainly ideological extremists by the standards of their day, but they were extremists for a good cause, and they were in fact perfectly happy to be regarded as extremists and thought of themselves as such. So here are some arguments for saying that we shouldn't go in for a kind of blanket condemnation of extremism. It depends on what kind of extremism you're talking about, and also on what the extremism is extremism in the cause of. Now, I want to say that we should resist this line of argument. We should resist this line of argument, and we should do so on the following basis. I want to say that the abolitionists campaigning against slavery, and indeed the suffragettes, who were extremists of the past, as it were, people who might have been regarded as extremists in their day, were actually radical Democrats rather than extremists. And this brings me to the last slide, a distinction that I am quite keen on now, which is the distinction between extremism and radicalism. So I think that these cases that people mention of good extremism are not cases of good extremism, they're actually cases of radicalism. And I think the distinction between extremism and radicalism is one that is extremely important for those of us who believe in the need for radical change in society, but who are not in favor of extremism. What do I mean by radicalism? So radicalism basically is opposition to gradualism. It's the idea that certain changes are urgently needed and that the urgently needed changes are fundamental changes. So a kind of classic statement of this radical axiom is Greta Thunberg, who says in one of her lectures, everything needs to change and it has to start today. So that is radicalism, as I understand it. Radicals are opposed to genuinely rotten compromises. They endorse the use of extra institutional means in pursuit of their objectives. So things like demonstrations, sit-ins, they are extra institutional means, and those are legitimate means for radicals to employ. Radicalism is not perhaps opposed to violence per se, but only endorses violence in very limited circumstances. And the final feature of radicalism, as I understand it, is that radicalism challenges mainstream thinking and questions assumptions that are usually unquestioned. That's what I understand by radicalism, and this really is the last slide now. History does indeed teach that radicalism has been the key to human progress and human freedom. I think history teaches also that extremism is a danger to human progress and human freedom, from which it follows that radicalism and extremism are not the same thing. Radicalism can, but need not, lead to extremism, we shouldn't tar all political radicals as extremists. And in recognition of the distinction between extremism and radicalism, we should refrain from describing the process of becoming an extremist, the radicalization process. That seems to be a misnomer in the light of the distinction between radicalism and extremism. Okay, so that's the take-home message. Extremism comes in 3 different varieties. I've said what those varieties are. It's a substantive question whether extremism is a bad thing, and we need to reflect carefully on the relationship between extremism and radicalism. That's it.
Thank you so much, Professor Cassam for that presentation on, and obviously a very complicated and weighty issue. To offer a discussant's response, we have another expert on extremism who's also done his own conceptualization of the term and the concept, J.M. Berger. J.M., off to you.
Thank you for having me. As Lydia pointed out earlier, it's about 3 a.m. here, so if I am a bit fuzzy, I hope you'll have a little patience with me. So I want to talk about making a case for a definition of extremism that is simpler, that is a categorical definition of extremism. So there are both legal and academic reasons why we need a categorical definition of extremism. Academically, we need to know how we can study things that are like movements that are somehow substantively similar to each other. So, for instance, if we're going to compare jihadism to white supremacism, what makes those movements similar to each other? What makes them different from each other? If we're going to reject the kind of binaries that we've seen historically, such as that, the word extremism was actually first popularized by Daniel Webster, who used it to describe both pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists in the antebellum United States. To my mind, those movements are not substantially similar to each other. So why would we compare pro-slavery and anti-slavery movements? Why would we compare anti-slavery movements to jihadism? I don't think we would. So academically, it's important that we have a category that, as much as possible, allows us to compare apples to apples. We want to be able to simplify the definition enough to apply it usefully, but we want to be able to have it be expansive enough to capture things that are not obvious, that are meaningfully similar to others. Legally, we also need these definitions to be clearer, both in terms of legal frameworks, such as determining what a CVE program does, and determining what kind of movements we're going to apply a CVE program to, and also from a policy perspective with social media companies and communications companies, what kind of movements are subject to content moderation and why? And can we do this consistently? Can we capture movements that are toxic without capturing movements that are usefully radical, that are progressively radical, that are attempting to ensure human rights or to right wrongs or fight injustice? So, as part of my doctoral research, this is really examining this kind of question and trying to test definition of extremism against very diverse examples. And in the course of working on this, for my literature review, I looked at all the definitions I could find in the literature, several dozen. Most people who write about extremism have bespoke definitions. They come up with a definition that is suited to their paper that allows them to call whatever it is they happen to be studying extremism. That's not a super helpful thing, but you can sort of break these definitions down into types. So there were 5 types of definition that I really found commonly represented in the literature. The first one is the idea that extremism represents beliefs that are far removed from societal norms. So it's fringe beliefs, uncommon beliefs, or beliefs that are strange or different to a mainstream kind of thought. The second kind of definition is tactics, or what Dr. Cassam would call methods extremism. So the use of tactics that have been deemed unacceptable by law or by societal norms, such as criminal violence, such as terrorism, mass casualty kinds of attacks, and different sorts of things. The third type of definition is opposition to the state. So certain states, it will not surprise you to hear that China and Russia are among them, define extremism as opposition to the state. That is the straight up definition. But it's not just those countries. As we heard in the first presentation, the PREVENT definition defines extremism as being opposed to British values. So, this is not just an authoritarian tactic. It is something that we see in democracies as well. The fourth type of definition, selected characteristics that have been observed in presumed extremists, such as intensity or rigidity of belief. Dr. Cassam would call this psychological extremism. And then the fifth type of definition defines extremism as a commitment to intergroup conflict. So I'm going to just talk about each of these definitions and where I see their strengths and weaknesses. The definition far from the center of society, fringe beliefs, this is the most problematic in many ways. Everything is relative to where the center of society is. So Nazis, as my litmus test, under this definition, Nazis in 1928 are extremists, and then in 1936 they're not extremists in a German context, and then in 1956 they're extremists again. So what changed in Nazi belief in that time? Not that much. It is really the society itself has changed. We're not measuring the thing itself, we're measuring the context in which it's happening. Far from the center of society definition can easily be used to demonize minorities, to justify genocide against the Uyghurs, the Rohingya. If somebody is simply different, they have beliefs that are not commonplace, that are not shared by a majority of people, they can be defined as extremism using this framework. You can also choose a social frame to manipulate the outcome. So if the Nazis were extremists in a global context, but not in a German context during their rise to power, which frame do you use? How do you justify the frame that you pick? Or do you just pick a frame that is convenient for whatever argument you're trying to mount? Unstable category. So as I mentioned with the Nazis, extremists stop being extremists once they become powerful. So you can be an extremist movement, a fringe movement, but if you take control of a country or a society, then suddenly you're not extremist anymore. Even if everything you believe is exactly the same as it was the day before. So this is just a terrible moving target kind of category. It doesn't allow us to compare like movements to like movements, and it doesn't allow us to track a movement over time as being extremist based on its beliefs and its activities. We're changing our definition of whether something is in the category based on what's happening elsewhere in its society. Tactics definition. So the tactics definition is somewhat better than the center of society definition, but when is a tactic extremist versus merely being criminal? Cartels are a very good example of this. A lot of drug cartels in Central America use tactics that are extremely similar to tactics that ISIS uses. Are they extremists or not? If they're motivated by a profit motive, can they be extremists if their goal is simply to make money or to seize political control, or do they have to have some kind of other goal, some sort of identity or ideological belief? When you have a civil war, when you have a guerrilla war, when you have just plain war, all of these things involve killing, sometimes massive numbers of people, sometimes killing civilians. So is war always extremist? You can certainly make an argument for that, but again, are you getting into a category where you can compare like movements? And then there's no consensus, even if you stipulate tactics, there's no consensus about what tactics are or are not extremists. We tend to focus on violence, but there are lots of non-violent tactics that extremists use, such as targeted harassment or segregation or discrimination. And then sometimes movements that we're sympathetic to use tactics that extremists, people we more clearly understand to be extremists, also use. So all of this, again, we get into very kind of subjective calls. We get into the problem of comparing movements that are not alike. So opposition to the state. I think this is probably pretty obvious what the problems with this are. This is complete. If the center of society is a way to privilege majorities, privileging the state is even more problematic. So we're giving complete privileged power. We're giving a definition that authoritarians and totalitarians love. We're criminalizing dissent. It's an unstable category. If there's regime change, suddenly extremism becomes different. It excludes a world of terrible behavior. It excludes state-driven genocides. It excludes the entities that are capable of doing the most damage in the name of extremism. So opposition to the state, deeply problematic. So characteristics-based gets to be more complicated. So we're getting sort of closer to the heart of the issue now, because we are actually talking about the thing itself. We're talking about what extremists do and say and how they believe. The problem is that we don't have clear agreement on what the traits are that represent extremist thought. So the most often cited in the literature is rigidity, the idea that extremists have very rigid mindsets, that they're always simplifying things, they see the world as very black and white, that they're completely inflexible. So the good news is that you can certainly make an argument for those traits in extremists. The bad news is that the argument doesn't hold up real well when you look at these groups over time. So for instance, the idea that extremists see everything as black and white and they have a very simplifying worldview is sort of countered by the fact that extremists write unbelievably complex ideological arguments and documents, to the point that sometimes they're incomprehensible to outsiders. You almost need to have a degree in the ideology to really understand what they're talking about. And we have inflexibility as a trait, and then that also doesn't hold up over time. So we have groups that evolve. We have Al-Qaeda evolving into ISIS. Elements of Al-Qaeda take on a new kind of ideology, a more extreme kind of ideology. Even ISIS, within its own parameters, its own self-definition has changed dramatically over the course of its history, and its history isn't that long. So these groups change. They're not inflexible. They're not rigid. They have the same kinds of pressures on them that everybody else does, and that they evolve. So we need to move past just the characteristics. And finally, you can also make an argument that the kinds of characteristics are going to be very different depending on the type of ideology. So how jihadists comport themselves may or may not be similar to how neo-Nazis comport themselves, may or may not be similar to how Maoists comport themselves. So the characteristics may be different depending on the culture that somebody's in, depending on the specific beliefs the group has. So this brings us to the fifth kind of definition, and this is the kind of definition that I prefer, because I feel that it captures most of the groups that we consider to be extremist. It captures them in a fairly objective way that can be defined in a functional way for societies, for legal frameworks, for content moderation frameworks. And it gets at sort of the fundamental things that make an extremist group recognizably extremist, which is conflict that is based around a group identity. So these aren't perfect definitions. They aren't going to capture everything. There are still going to be gray areas. We'll always have that. But I think that this body of definitions, this set of definitions that fall under intergroup conflict, reduce ambiguities. So there are a lot of things that are good about an intergroup conflict-based definition, and there are a few of these that are in the literature. They're the least common out of all the ones I've discussed, but Clark and Moskalenko use it, and then some other people use it. It's not limited to violent conflict. So it's about conflict between groups. So we can talk about things like discrimination or segregation or harassment. It's not partisan in that you don't really have to be talking about left, right. You don't have to get into who's the more extremist, what kinds of things are extremist. It covers religious and racial and nationalist and many other kinds of extremism. So it's a category that allows us to compare things that are not always obviously similar, but they share a really important kind of common thread. It gives us a good category to really do the academic research of comparative studies. We don't really have a long history of doing comparative study of extremism. There's been a lot of movement toward that recently, and almost all of that is far right versus jihadist kind of things, and which are actually kind of very similar constructs, but we want to be able to go wider than that. We want to be able to talk about things that are less obvious, and I'll hopefully be addressing some of that in my dissertation. Right now, I'm looking at the ideology of slavery in the United States, racial slavery in the United States, which is often excluded from these other definitions we've talked about because it was the mainstream of society. People dismiss it as being a product of its time, but my argument is that it's similar to a jihadist ideology. It's similar to a white supremacist, modern white supremacist ideology in important respects. So we do need to test this on some edge type movements. There are some movements where we need to really sort of like do the work, go in and assess whether this definition would work. For instance, anti-abortion extremism is, on the face of it, the very simple formulation of being against the practice of abortion does not fit this definition. But I think when you look at some of the literature, you look at the ideological statements that these groups make, that you will often see that they are, in fact, framing this as a group conflict. But we need to do this work. We need to do the testing of this, and this is part of what my doctoral research is trying to do. So the definition that I use, I'll close out by just putting it out there. The in-group and out-group, I think most of the people in this session know what that means, but the in-group is the group to which you belong. The out-group is anybody who's excluded from that group. And I've defined an extremist ideology here as just the texts that describe who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group, and how the in-group should interact with the out-group. So the definition I put forward in my book, and that I generally lobby for, is that extremism is the belief that an in-group's success or health is inseparable from taking hostile action against an out-group. So what I mean by that is that the in-group believes that it cannot be successful or helpful unless it is constantly engaged in hostile action against an out-group. I think that this definition captures most of the kinds of groups we're already talking about as extremist, and it gives us a useful framework to try and put groups in and out of this framework. It gives us a category that we can do comparative work, and it gives us a set of criteria, a complex set of criteria that spring out from this sort of simple statement that allow us to assess a group, how it interacts with other groups, and what its beliefs are, and how it is likely to behave. So I will finish up there. Hopefully my sleepy brain wasn't too incoherent, and I'll turn it over for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, JM. I certainly would not have been able to put together such a cogent presentation at 3 a.m. So kudos to you, and thank you actually to all of our presenters for those excellent presentations and all of the ideas that you highlighted for us. We have a number of questions. I know I had these presentations have sparked a number of questions in my own head, but I'll cede the floor to the attendees first. And ask some of the questions that have been in the Q&A. The first one is probably first directed to Professor Cassam, but other panels feel free to address it as well. And the questioner asks, does the distinction between radicalism and extremism run the risk of differentiating change that we like and change that we don't like?
Well, I think it does run that risk. But it's a risk that we basically just need to work hard to avoid. I mean, one reason for thinking that in the end there is a real distinction here concerns the methods used by radicals and extremists. So methods extremists are committed to the use of methods that radicals will typically not be prepared to use. I think the problem with not recognizing a distinction between radicalism and extremism, the problem is that you end up then calling radical movements campaigning for radical change, they will all come out as extremists. And I think that's something that one wants to avoid. You see this particularly with climate change activism, where in the UK, some climate change activist organizations have been classified as extremists and terrorists. That's a kind of way of delegitimizing them. And I think we need to make room for the idea of campaigning for immediate radical change to deal with climate change without, as a result, classifying all of these people as extremists.
Before we move on to other questions, would any of the panelists also like to address that?
I don't have a lot to add, but I do think the idea of activism is a useful one. Like the distinction between extremism and radicalism sometimes, yeah, to me seems a little bit blurred and gets into some of the problems that JM raised about relativism. You know, what are we going to support or not? So activism, but then I understand that like activism might encompass a certain amount of action, and then there is a scope beyond that that we should be supporting. So maybe radicalism or being radical is not necessarily the right term, but there is something there that should be supported, and history proves those examples.
I would just also add that, you know, the framework that I trying to promote to some extent gets us around some of these things. So, you know, environmental activism or abolitionism is pretty clearly not extremist under this definition, but it doesn't get us out of every gray area. So one issue that people often bring up is Antifa. If you are Antifa group, your out group is another extremist group. It's fascist. And so, you know, it's certainly relatable to be eternally committed to hostile action against fascists. Does that make Antifa extremist or not? And I think that that's where we get into some of these gray areas to struggle with this. So I think that there's definitely, you know, radical ideas and people who are called extremists. One reason to really try and come up with some parameters around the term that are reasonably objective is that, you know, we want to make space for people to bring radical ideas that can make the world a better place.
And I suppose too, with this example of Antifa, to use your concept of in-group, out-group, with groups like Antifa, for example, they don't have as rigidly defined definitions of an out-group, or one that they need to be in conflict with in that way.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, it gets fuzzy. The other thing is that, you know, when we get into sort of political or class kinds of issues where the identity of the outgroup is very changeable, you know, that's where things can get tricky. And sometimes things are less extremist if you're like trying to change classes, for instance, like, you know, the communist revolution, like if you change everybody's financial status, then everybody who's in the out group is suddenly in the in group, and vice versa. And it still gets messy. There's no way to avoid that.
Yeah, certainly a lot of complexity. It brings us to our next question, which is about politician or government responses, but here politically politicians' responses to extremism. And the questioner asks, could some of the measures from politicians responding to extremism also be regarded as not so much extreme, but Manichaean, black and white, you know, thinking? The questioner says, you know, no one loses votes by being strong on terrorism. So is there room in the political or government response to have nuance? Or does the you know, the functioning of electoral democracy kind of invite very rigid responses to extremism and terrorism? And anyone can feel free to take that one on. Maybe Keiran, if you.
Yeah, well, I mean, the you're either with us or against us is kind of the classic example of that. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a problem that we see not just in counterterrorism, but when we see it in criminology all the time, more generally, that you know, tough on law and order politics, you know, and the benefits of that for political parties. You know, after an attack, nobody's going to come out as a political leader and say the best thing we can do is actually have early interventions and less of a focus on coercive measures or so on. So I think there is definitely a politics to this, and aligning the people against an enemy can be beneficial. I'd like to think that's changing, but I think it is a pretty persistent problem in other areas of crime prevention too. And it probably is an argument for developing law and policy responses to extremism and terrorism, not in response to events, at which point it's very hard for more nuanced responses to come through, and to have a persistent effort to keep investing in these things over time.
I also have a question in the same area. So supposing that I'm a British government minister, and I regard my in-group as the British people, and I believe that Britain is threatened by radical fundamentalists who reject British values. So I think that the success or flourishing of Britain is inseparable from hostile action against these outgroups that challenge fundamental British values. Does that count as extreme? Does that make me an extremist by JM's definition?
So similar to the Antifa question, we're getting into one of the gray areas here. But what I would say what's problematic in that statement and problematic in the prevent strategy documents is the identification of British values as this kind of specter of the thing. So British values are values, they're not necessarily stable values over time. They're not necessarily well defined, and it gives you a lot of room to abuse that. So when you use that formulation, there's a lot of room for abuse that would fall into kind of an extremist, kind of nationalist, populist, anti-immigrant kind of attitudes that can really play out in that kind of space. So, I think that I think it's good for us to be talking about whether that's an extremist, whether that has a taint of extremism around it, and whether there's a better way to formulate the goals and strategies that is less prone to abuse.
Well, we have a clarification request for JM, and it says under JM's definition, some terrorism would not necessarily be extremism. Terrorism is a tactic, and groups, individuals can cease to use it and negotiate or desist. So what implications might that have for government initiatives, the questioner is asking, and if certain groups have a propensity to negotiate and use terrorism tactically, can they then be considered extremist?
So there's certainly, you can come up with hypotheticals of the use of terrorist tactic that would not be extremist, but in practice, it seems like most of the groups that use extremism do seem to be have extremist beliefs behind them. So there are certainly, in the case of occupation, guerrilla warfare, there was a movie in the 1980s when I was in high school called Red Dawn, about the Soviet Union invading the United States, and small town high schoolers become terrorists to fight them off. And you can find a lot of this stuff in fiction where there's a real kind of ambiguous tenor to the use of terrorism, but in the real world, terrorism is frequently, unless it's really incredibly narrowly targeted, is almost always associated with some broader extremist ideology.
Excellent, thank you. And it's also similar to an Australian, I think, novel and now movie, Tomorrow When the War Began, where a group of teenagers fight off an invasion of China. We have a question here. And this is to you, Dr. Hardy, and it's a question about extended supervision orders regimes that's here in Australia. So to those not familiar, in Australia, there's a regime, a supervisory regime that certain terrorists who have been already convicted and are labeled as high-risk terrorist offenders can then be have their sentences extended after that they've already served their time. Would you classify that also as a type of countering violent extremism legislation, considering that we're kind of addressing potential future risks? And how would you put that type of supervisory order in that regime within the rule of law that you're taking a look at?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. And part of the answer is I already thought I had enough examples, so I left the extended supervision and continuing detention off the end. Yeah, so obviously that involves like weighing up the risk and similar kinds of conditions as well. So I think similar kinds of things will apply. I think so in terms of like certainty being an aim, so we would have legality by having the orders, but there's still kind of a lack of certainty as to how they would apply, and I think that will develop over time. I think we don't have enough experience yet with people in Australia coming to the ends of their sentences to really know how this will be applied, but when it is applied, it should be applied equally. But some of these, so when I say about sentencing principles and so on, some of these actually play against each other. I mean, obviously, like you can have the purpose of punishment being deterrence or rehabilitation, and those two things play against each other. So I think some of those kind of tensions can play out in other ways as well. So, for example, like precedent and equality, meaning we should treat people the same, but then individualized justice, meaning that we should really take into account the individual circumstances in a particular case. And those two things are kind of an argument for consistency on the one hand and kind of difference in individual circumstances on the other. So I think what I want to tease out in the later part of this paper are actually some of those tensions in the law, like under the ESO regime and other areas where, these things around kind of enforceability versus kind of voluntariness. You can't force somebody to change. And ESOs, I think, will kind of play into that tension. I think what the CDO, like the continuing detention order and the extended supervision order regimes also raise is this issue that, the law can't solve everything. I think if we end up with people on a rolling cycle of detention, extended supervision, and control orders as well can be used in a similar kind of way, showing that the law is not really capable of reducing that risk. It can just kind of, you can put people in prison and we can manage, but there may well be people who are stuck in this ongoing cycle. And how we manage that, there are no easy answers to at the moment.
Thank you. Our next question is for Professor Cassam, and it's related to the point that you made about radicalism. And the questioner asks, you've remarked that pluralism means accepting that people can live their version of the good life, quote unquote, within the law. But the law itself both prescribes and proscribes the limits of the good and the not good. Do we need to distinguish more clearly between what we might call radical pluralism, which would embrace various forms of extremism, and consensus pluralism that agrees upon some limits?
I think that's a really helpful distinction. I think that in terms of radical pluralism, one of the difficulties that we face here is that a radical pluralist is going to have to accept that certain people's visions of the good life include passionate opposition to pluralism, and there is then the question of how we deal with that fact. I think that a true pluralist needs to accept that possibility and simply focus on a very kind of narrow legal framework in which what is ruled out is the use of particular forms of violence in pursuit of one's political objectives. But as for the nature of those objectives or the content of those objectives, I think from a kind of pluralist perspective, we need to be minimally prescriptive about that, as long as people operate within the law.
Thank you. This is another question for Dr. Hardy, and it's around the number of counterterrorism laws in the Australian context. So in Australia, I think we have 82 laws enacted, a whole raft of counterterrorism legislation, and there's been some criticism that the sheer number of laws have been a bit of overkill. And I'm wondering if you have any comment about, one, the very high number of laws around CT in Australia, and whether you think that there could be an issue surrounding additional laws to deal with countering violent extremism, and how do these countering violent extremism laws potentially intersect or clash with democratic principles and civil liberties? Because particularly as there's no Bill of Rights in Australia and we're relying on common law, there is greater leeway to enact laws relating to counterterrorism rather than strictly countering violent extremism rather than countering terrorism.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. And yeah, we counted up to 92 recently.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
it's likely to keep going up. I suppose that the number is one thing. I think partly, like, if there's something positive about that number, I think it is a belief in legality. And while, you know, certainty might not be possible all of the time, I think the large number does come from a belief in Australia that having laws and writing laws on these things is much better than leaving it to pure executive power. So I think that's kind of one starting point. But then it does kind of come across as quite striking that Australia has been able to enact so many laws and, you know, with a scope that often is wider than what is possible in other countries with formal human rights protection. So, and, you know, I won't go over all the kind of issues with different laws, but certainly over time, there's been issues with, you know, control orders and PDOs and a range of powers. So I think that if we are to add new laws for countering violent extremism, I think it's, there may well be gaps in the legal framework, say around hate symbols and so on. I actually think the kind of newer laws that we would need, or it will be like things like I identified, such as changing the non-parole period requirement around sentencing, I think would be a really helpful one. Making sure that the privacy framework applies appropriately in CVE cases for early intervention is another. So maybe tweaking other areas of the law as well that apply more generally. And then also in terms of specific kind of CVE laws, it may not be with a counterterrorism focus specifically, but around hate crime, and the urging violence offences occur to me as falling reasonably well within JM's definition of extremism too. So I suspect that the CVE won't necessarily be adding to that same kind of coercive or supervisory regimes in the same way, but actually trying to think a little bit in an innovative way about how do we use laws in other ways to improve the system and the structure for people who may need early interventions. And there may well be some underlying tensions in the law that act as barriers, but I think there's a few small changes that would actually help quite a lot.
Well, we'll come to the end of the session and we have one final question, and this one's for JM before we close. And this question relates to that center of society definition that you highlighted of extremism. And the question is, what happens when extremism goes not necessarily mainstream, but gets in that in-between space between not being fully control of society and government, but enough that, you know, enough people believe in something that it can't just be considered fringe. And, you know, here I'm thinking of, like, say, political candidates with QAnon beliefs, or who supported the insurrection, or parliamentary candidates that believe in and promote conspiracy theories. What are the implications, do you think, of countering violent extremism in that in-between space?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult. And, you know, one reason that I don't like that center of society definition is that it kind of postulates that there's a cutoff point where we're going to stop treating the movement as extremist because it has reached a certain kind of critical mass. So I think in terms of the practical implications of doing CVE in this context, there is much of our thinking about CVE has been based on the fringe kind of definition and concept. So we're targeting ISIS, and we're targeting Atomwaffen division, and we're targeting these very small groups, and we can do all kinds of things with a very small fringe group that we can't do with a 40% of the electorate, you know, in a country. So the kinds of tactics that we use are really going to have to change. You know, just take, since I do a lot of work on policy in the online space, I'll just take that as the example. If you have a fringe movement like ISIS or Atomwaffen Group, and you can drive them off of the major platforms and into kind of dark corners of the internet where they can't recruit, that's a big win, generally speaking. You're really you're stopping this ideology from spreading, you're containing it, you're pushing them into a space where they can possibly be monitored more easily. So that works great if you're dealing with a movement that has 5,000 or 10,000 or 20 or 50,000 people. If the movement has 1 million people or 10 million people or 30 million people, then that tactic isn't going to be effective anymore, because that's enough people to have a critical mass that they're going to have social interactions offline. They're going to have social interactions on spaces that are much larger. So you can't, and this is, this I think will not make a lot of people happy, because for real obvious reasons having to do with fairness and enforcement, but the strategy of sort of containment and aggressive content moderation is probably going to have to evolve in different ways when you're dealing with a movement of that size. And I would say QAnon certainly is a movement that's large enough now that you have to really start, thinking about what are the second order consequences of trying to use the same old CVE tactics on a group of that size.
Well, thank you so much, JM, to all of our presenters. I really want to sincerely thank you for all of this. We've had such a stimulating, not only presentations, but a discussion and answers and responses in the Q&A sessions. We've had a stellar first day of the AVERT Research Network Symposium, and I can't think of a better way to end it. So thank you to all of you, particularly JM, who stayed up until 3 a.m. I'm hoping you're going straight to bed after this. And tomorrow morning, we have an excellent lineup of speakers that continues, and we'll start bright and early at 8 a.m. Australian time and kick off with a keynote address from Professor Maura Conway on connections between terrorism and internet studies. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.